Hello everyone, welcome to my Ghostwire Tokyo Tatari difficulty. No skill upgrades, no healing items walkthrough. This will be chapters 1 and 2, because chapter 1 is incredibly short, so I thought I'd pair it up with chapter 2. And this is the beginning of a walkthrough of a game that I originally had hesitations about, because Ghostwire Tokyo was not what I was expecting initially. I thought this game would have a very similar gameplay format to the Evil Within series, given that the Evil Within series has to be one of the greatest survival horror series ever made, and it embraces a lot of complexity with its fundamental mechanics. You do not have to be so reliant upon upgrades in the Evil Within. It has a really fun high difficulty, which is a Kumu difficulty, a difficulty mode where you die in one hit, forcing you to strategize, forcing you to think tactically, and take advantage of the hidden designs and the complex mechanics of the Evil Within. Evil Within 2, it didn't have a Kumu difficulty initially. It had a classic difficulty, which was not a very good difficulty, and the game had optimization problems. Classic difficulty was a difficulty mode where it was basically normal difficulty, I believe. Actually, no, I think it was nightmare difficulty, but I think the enemies had like normal difficulty health, but they did like nightmare difficulty damage to you. But you could only save 7 times. And the optimization issues in the Evil Within 2, the game had crashes. And the crashes were definitely a major hindrance in classic difficulty's ability to actually be a functional difficulty. And it didn't really do anything impressive. And also, the Evil Within 2, it did have some problems with its combat mechanics, and there were some issues with its animations, but overall, it was still a very fun game, and I enjoyed it. And I also intend on doing updated walkthroughs, using the same format that I used for the previous Akumu difficulty walkthroughs I did of those games. But that is the Evil Within series. But going back to Ghostwire Tokyo, Ghostwire Tokyo, as you can see, is an open world game with a first-person perspective, favoring a supernatural take, and a combat system that it looks like it's pretty basic, but to me, it does have a bit of complexity, but not to the same degree as with Evil Within. And it does feature some stealth, and there are a wide variety of enemies, but a lot of the times in the combat encounters of Ghostwire Tokyo, you'll be spending a lot of time fighting the same walker enemies, and also with the Students of Misery and the Students of Pain, which, speaking of which, we're fighting right now. So the Rain Walker is the one with the umbrella. That's the standard Rain Walker. Then we have the Students of Misery. There are different variations to these enemies depending on their outfits. They respond differently to stuns, and they also have different HP thresholds. But let me talk about that later on. I just need to discuss the basic introduction to Ghostwire Tokyo with this walkthrough. But as I was saying, Ghostwire Tokyo, I had initial hesitations about, but it's a fun game. That being said, though, it does have problems, not just with the gameplay, but also with its story, with its length. But I'll talk about those later on. Right now, we're being introduced to the basic combat mechanics of Ghostwire Tokyo, and let me just explain what's happening here. So, you are playing as a human character named Akito, who has been possessed by a spirit named KK. And through KK's possession, Akito is able to utilize something called ethereal weaving. And ethereal weaving comes with 3 different elements. The first element you have initially is wind, which is what I was using to deal with those enemies. To think of your elements in the context of guns, wind is kind of your pistol/machine gun equivalent. So it is the fastest firing element you have in your arsenal, and it isn't as damaging as your other elements. And that's wind. The next element you get is fire. Fire is on par with that of the grenade launcher or a bazooka. So it is heavily damaging to one enemy, and if you charge it, you will be able to do something equivalent to that of a grenade launcher, where you basically trigger an explosion, it has a certain radius to it, and it will either knock over enemies or make them flinch. That's definitely your go-to option when dealing with high-powered enemies, that you need to take advantage of the stun generated by the charge attack in order to stand a bit of a chance. The next element you get is water, and that's all the elements you get. But water is kind of your shotgun equivalent, only the basic attack on the water is pitiful in its damage. It is awful. The only thing you should be using water for is its charge attack. because the charge attack, it at least does a decent amount of damage, and it generates stun on the enemy most of the time, and you have to get in pretty close to the enemy in order for the stun to be a bit more consistent. But water has no range, and it's not really the best option when dealing with a lot of the bosses on this game or dealing with a lot of high-powered enemies. I will use water against one of the bosses in the finale of the game. This boss is called Okina. It's the spider boss you deal with. That boss is the worst boss on this game, but I'll talk about Okina when I get the chance. But we're being introduced to the general gameplay loop that this game likes to favor with its main story and also with its side content. You'll see right in front of me there is something called a Tori Gate, and the Tori Gate is corrupted. And like I said, this is the general gameplay loop. In order to get rid of the fog that pollutes the map, and the fog prevents you from actually progressing into the areas, you have to cleanse these Tori Gates. And I feel like they invested so heavily into the Tori Gate mechanic that I feel they kind of used it as a way to substitute for moments where the story could have been a little bit more fleshed out, because the main story on this game is very short, and this was so unexpected for an open world game to have this short of a story. Like, the story on this game isn't even as long as the stories you get in The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2. And while I do like that the side activities do flesh out the story, and I do like that they talk about a lot of points with lore in a lot of the collectibles that you get, that still shouldn't be an excuse to make your main story very short, but I'll reserve this kind of tangent talk for the later videos. This is a protection mission right now, so when you progress through the main story, there can be these world events that trigger randomly, where you have to defend these cubes that have these souls of human beings within them from these visitors, and the visitors are pretty much the names of these enemies. Like, the enemies overall, like, all of these different enemy types are classified as visitors. That's their category, but they just have different names, and they fight differently, and they look differently. But the protection sections of Ghostwire Tokyo are something that I really love in this game, because you might have noticed earlier on that when I was getting introduced to the stealth, I did something called a quick purge, and that's basically the stealth attack of the game, where you place a talisman on an enemy and you expose their core, and then the character just grabs the core and rips it out. You can do that mechanic in the middle of combat during the protection missions, because what you'll notice is whenever the visitors are trying to attack the cubes, or your allies, and your allies are just as spiritual as the souls that you save from those cubes, they will go into an animation where they will stand still and raise their hands in order to drain the spirit. And during that animation, they are vulnerable to the quick purge, which is the mechanic that you just saw right there, where I stealth took down that guy. And now we're inside this convenience store right here. And the convenience store, I don't like to buy a lot of consumables, and obviously that's why the no healing item restriction is being applied. And I also did talk about the no skill upgrades. So this game does have an upgrade system, just like the Evil Within, only it is not forced upon you like most open world games. And I think this is definitely one of the strengths of this game, because so many open world games are designed around XP and getting a ton of skills. And in games like the Batman Arkham series, you don't think anything of that, because I feel like the way the Batman Arkham series implements its skills and its XP system isn't as forceful, and actually feels like you're still learning skills at the same pace as the main story, so you never feel like you go into a section of the main story or a side mission and you don't have necessary combat skills that actually balance out a combat encounter. Like, you're practically learning a lot of useful skills very early on, so that you're standing a chance against these sections. And that's a great example of a game series that does the XP system properly. But Ghostwire Tokyo doesn't have that, and that is really good, because most open world games nowadays have to be pay-to-win designs, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Origins, where the XP system and the leveling in those games is so forceful that you practically have to do side missions in order to progress the main story, and that is so fucking stupid. But this game doesn't do that, and the side content on this game is one of the most enjoyable parts of Ghostwire Tokyo. While a lot of people think the side missions in Ghostwire Tokyo are very repetitive, it's all a matter of looking at those side missions from the correct perspective. And compared to most open world games where the side missions feel so cookie cutter and they feel very uninspired and uninteresting and they don't really have writing and animations on par with that of the main story, Ghostwire Tokyo is a huge exception in that case, and I really enjoyed the side missions. If you want to see my blind reaction to Ghostwire Tokyo, check out my blind playthrough. I really enjoyed the side missions. I did all of them except for one, which is the Tanuki Hunt side mission, which I still don't know exactly how it works. I've never gotten a Tanuki, so I don't know how the mechanic works. But the side missions in general were just very, very fun. I didn't feel like a single side mission was bad. Even if some of them were very short, it was all there just to flesh out the story of Akito and KK and really give us more depth to their characters. And that's when you know you have good side missions in an open world game, when the side missions contribute to the main story in some way, whether it be through actually undermining the villain's influence or with actually fleshing out characters. And that's why I like the side missions on this game. I mean, will they be enjoyable to go through like multiple times? I don't know. I'll have to see for myself if I ever do decide to go through the side missions. But for this walkthrough, I did not go through the side missions. I focused entirely on the main story. And I think this should lead me on to what Tatari difficulty is. So, Tatari difficulty is the hardest difficulty of this game. It isn't as hard as Akumu difficulty, but its modifiers are pretty interesting, at least with one modifier. But Tatari difficulty, the enemies are at their most damaging. They will deal a lot of damage to you, but not kill you instantly, which is a good thing, because I feel like this game, I do feel like the way the game is handled, I don't feel it's complementary to the whole idea of a one-hit kill difficulty, with its open world design, with the way the enemies are designed, with certain mechanics on your character. I'll explain a little bit more in the later parts of this video. But that's the first part of Tatari difficulty. The second part to Tatari difficulty, which is something that I wasn't expecting, and I think this is really the first game I've played where this has ever been a mechanic, is it disables XP entirely. You cannot get XP from missions, and I played through Tatari difficulty the first time I got into Ghostwire Tokyo, so I have no idea what the XP system does in Ghostwire Tokyo. But what I will say, though, is the fact that this game is throwing away a design that, in all honesty, serves as so much of a hindrance in so many open world games is a really smart design choice. It is trusting the fact that its fundamental systems can actually be worked around and you can play the game without ever having to be reliant upon upgrades. But one thing I will say about the upgrades that I do kind of agree with the reviews is that the upgrade system on this game is very rudimentary and very basic, because as much as the characters would like to say that you are learning new moves in the upgrade system, and really this only applies to one move, which is the ability to actually finish off enemies on the ground when they're knocked over, which is a really dumb design choice. Like, the whole ability to finish off enemies on the ground, I don't see why such a basic mechanic that feels on par with that of breathing should be locked behind an upgrade system. Evil Within gave you access to the Stomp ability, and it gave you access to matches, which were a consumable that allowed you to finish off enemies instantly in the Evil Within series. In Evil Within 2, you didn't have the matches, but you had access to the Stomp, and it instantly killed enemies on that game. You did not have to purchase an ability to stomp enemies. Like, stomping is such a basic thing that even a normal human being can do, that there is no justification you can give as to why it should be locked behind a skill tree system. And it just kind of drags out the combat when you don't indulge in that skill. But you're already going to be investing a lot into dealing like high damage to the enemies that you won't have to worry so much about the lack of a stomp ability on this game. But that's really the only quote-unquote new move that you ever learn within the upgrade system. The upgrade system on this game, all it does is enhance your fundamentals. Like, for instance, increased fire rate on your wind ability, increased speed on actually grabbing cores from this game, which is something I need to talk about as well. So when you put enemies into critical health, they will stand still, and the game will give you the option to hold L2 in order to rip out their cores. And once you fill up the circle, the enemy will be killed. And whenever you extract cores from enemies, it heals you a bit, which is another reason why I didn't want to do a no damage walkthrough of this game. And also why I didn't want to use healing items for this walkthrough, because I'll already be healing myself through extracting cores and by doing stealth attacks on the enemies. One thing you need to note about the health on this game is whenever you escape combat, the game will regenerate your health up to a certain threshold into yellow state, which is something that I talked about in my blind playthrough that I really love. And people like Under the Mayo will say that it is very noobish, this and that, but when you are in the red state of health in Ghostwire Tokyo, the screen will flash, you get blood on your screen, and the audio will be muffled as well. So you expect me to believe, Under the Mayo, that you want to favor that kind of design, where you're going to be running through the game with those kind of annoyances on screen at all time that hinders your ability to enjoy the game. And he says the same thing for Resident Evil 7 and Village. And he says that it's incredibly stupid that Resident Evil 7 and Village offer a regenerative health ability where when you're in critical state, if you stand still or you don't engage in combat for a while, you regenerate up to yellow health. But when are you ever going to experience this kind of situation on the highest difficulty of Resident Evil Village? And furthermore, your movement is slowed, you have blood on your screen, the audio is screwed up a bit. Like, you could easily remove all that and just make it where Ethan dies when he goes into that state. Like, you're favoring a more annoying and tedious option rather than the simple option of just simply killing the character off. That doesn't impact your ability to enjoy the game. Like, who wants to sit through that, and who wants to waste time waiting for their life to regenerate when you don't have healing items? And you'll already be restarting the checkpoint so that you don't get into the situation? What the fuck are you talking about, Under the Mayo? That has to be one of the stupidest statements I have ever heard from anyone ever. But ignoring that, you regenerate your health whenever you return to a stealth profile in Ghostwire Tokyo, which is a really good design choice. But going back to the talk on the upgrade system of this game, the upgrade system only exists to enhance the fundamentals, just like the Evil Within 1's upgrade system, because the Evil Within 1's upgrade system, it enhanced certain fundamental characteristics on Sebastian's character, like being able to run fast, having more health, and it also enhanced certain fundamental parameters on the guns as well. When you did fully upgrade, like the harpoon bolts, for instance, you did gain access to a fire ability, but considering that you already had to go through a lot of upgrades in order to get to that point, it really feels like it is still part of like the fundamental nature to the upgrade system, but it doesn't matter. Like, I'm glad that the upgrade system is very rudimentary, because it means that this game doesn't feature a pay-to-win design, because most games nowadays with their open world formats want to favor a pay-to-win route where you have to pretty much slot into XP like crazy in order to gain access to abilities that should have been available at the start. And in this game, only one ability is neglected from that criteria, but in the Evil Within and the Evil Within 2, you had access to every ability that you needed at baseline. You did not have to purchase upgrades, although in the Evil Within 2's case, I really liked having to purchase the Corner Kill and the Bottle Break ability, because I feel like those abilities just fleshing out the gameplay a little bit more in the Evil Within 2. But in Evil Within 1, I have no regrets with not actually slotting into the upgrade system in the Evil Within. Ooh, this right here, this is kind of a mini-boss encounter. This is a Kuchisake. You will need to keep your distance from this enemy, because this enemy is very aggressive. So what you'll need to do, and I should have done this beforehand, but I should have made sure I had some ether, which is something I need to talk about as well. So in order to regenerate your ether and actually get more ammunition, you need to destroy crystallized objects that will release ether. And also, by the way, one thing that the game doesn't tell you is whenever you find just random ether on the ground, or when you actually reveal ether but it's too far away from you, hold L2, like hold your aim button so that you draw the ether towards you. That is a very important tip to note. But I should have meleeed or destroyed some more crystallized ether so that I would be able to get more fire for this fight. But the fire that I had was enough. And the explosive canisters around here, not only will they stun the Kuchisake, but they will give red ether, which is the ammunition for your fire elemental. But what you need to do against the Kuchisake right here is you need to use the charge attack on your fire to just continually stun her and keep your distance. The Kuchisake is, as the game suggests, a very relentless enemy. It's an enemy born from a relentless frenzy, so that is why it is a very aggressive enemy. And it does have a melee attack, which you'll need to perfectly block or just run away from. And given that I talked about the perfectly blocking, I need to talk about that mechanic real quick, because it's one of my least favorite mechanics in the game. So this game, rather than utilizing some kind of dodge system, it utilizes a block system. If you hold L1, you'll block, and you will not be able to mitigate damage by just normally blocking attacks. The only way you're going to mitigate damage entirely is by perfectly blocking, which is by pressing L1 at the right moment before an enemy attack lands. However, that is the only purpose the perfect block has on this game. It is there for the single purpose of allowing you to avoid damage entirely. And it is not a fleshed out mechanic. The amount of lost potential displayed with the perfect block is absurd. I mean, you do have the ability to redirect projectiles back at enemies, but it is only there to complement the skill upgrade where you purchase the ability to finish off enemies when they're on the ground. And given that you're going to be in a lot of encounters where enemies are in their high numbers, it's so hard to close in on an enemy that is knocked to the ground in order to use the quick purge on them, because the other enemies will be supporting them, preventing you from actually getting near them. So there is no incentive to indulge in the perfect block's redirect ability. Oh, by the way, right there, that tiny enemy that has the jacket and the umbrella, that is called a Forlorn. There's also a red variant known as a Forsaken, but you cannot kill that enemy with your bow, and you cannot damage it with your ethereal weaving. It is completely resistant to all ranged options, and the only way you're going to finish that enemy off is if you get behind it and do the quick purge. Because that is an enemy designed to alert other enemies. And when it spots you, it will scream, it will disappear, and a couple of enemies will spawn. The Forsaken, I think it always spawns a Lamentation, but you haven't met the Lamentation yet, so I won't talk about that enemy. Like, there's a lot of stuff in the game that, for this early part of the game, it's not worth talking about right now. That's just a testament to how much this game has, but at the same time, not really having a lot of complexity to be on par with that of the Evil Within. But going back to what I was saying about the perfect block, there are many other avenues to avoid damage, and most of the time when you perfectly block something, you are putting yourself in danger. And the perfect block isn't useful against range attacks where enemies fire multiple projectiles at you, because not only do the visual effects of achieving a perfect block kind of obscure your vision, but the perfect block also slows down time for a split second, and that is just enough for you to miscalculate when you are supposed to initiate a perfect block on multiple projectiles. And if you have multiple projectiles so close to each other, and they're closing the distance to you, you have got to avoid them rather than perfectly block them. It's so hard to get the timing down sometimes because of the way the visual effects and the slow motion affect your ability to block those projectiles effectively. I'm not saying don't do it, because this can be very helpful against certain bosses like Yasuo Toko, which is the first boss of this game, where he has access to a wind ability where he fires 3 projectiles at you, and you have got to learn how to perfectly block them rather than avoid them, because those projectiles hone in on your location. So, like, when it comes to homing projectiles, you have got to understand the timing on when you are supposed to use the perfect block in order to deal with those projectiles. But again, there are many other avenues for avoiding damage in this game that don't require the use of a perfect block. Like, the incentive to do the perfect block is very little, and even with the upgrades, where when you perfectly block, you have the ability to generate ether upon perfect block activation, it's still not enough to actually warrant the use of the perfect block. And the perfect block is one of the worst mechanics on this game. It's the same with the melee attack as well. So you do have access to a melee attack by pressing R3, but it's useless. It doesn't generate hit reaction on the enemy. It doesn't do enough damage. And because it doesn't generate hit reaction, you are pretty much putting yourself at risk to be hit by an enemy. It's so trash. So try to make sure that you're just attacking a lot of crystallized ether in the area so that you just regenerate your ether. And I do like the idea of the crystallized ether, and it can also serve as makeshift cover as well in order to avoid certain projectiles. But sometimes when it comes to the crystallized ether, it can spawn out of the blue at a very inopportune moment, and you'll accidentally clip on the crystallized ether when you're trying to avoid an attack. And this can be a problem during certain boss fights, or against the Kuchisake boss fight that we did, where you're trying to run away from certain attacks, you accidentally clip on the crystallized ether, or you accidentally back up into the crystallized ether, and an enemy gets a free hit on you because of that. So you've got to mind your surroundings when worrying about the crystallized ether in the area. But here's some stealth, and you'll also notice that we have access to a bow and arrow. The bow and arrow is really good on this game. It is really good for dealing with a lot of the basic enemies, and it's even good against the higher tiered enemies. Try to prioritize headshots. With those enemies that were in the air, those enemies are called wanderers, those ghost enemies. They die very fast. The wind is enough to deal with them, but use the bow at a distance. Like, those enemies can be a random variable during these stealth encounters, and when one enemy spots you, they will alert other enemies. Not always, though. It kind of varies, almost to the same degree as with Evil Then 2, but at least with Evil Then 2, the only way the enemies were going to alert other enemies is if they did the roar animation when they spotted you. But if they didn't do the roar animation, which was random, by the way, they would not alert other enemies. But we've cleansed the Torii Gate. You have to cleanse these Torii Gates in order to progress with the main story, to remove the fog that is blocking your progress to the main objective. But removing this Torii Gate will allow you to gain access to the talismans, which is mandatory. And this is really cool. I love that it's not just the ethereal weaving. You're also gaining access to abilities specific to human beings as well. But this talisman is my favorite talisman in the game. This is on par with the flash bolts from the Evil Within, or not really the smoke bolts, though, because with the smoke bolts you had to buy an upgrade in the Evil Within 2 to give you the ability to stealth kill enemies, which is fucking stupid. Like, the whole ability to put enemies into a stun state, like, the fact that you were using smoke and that generated the actual stun, apparently the game classed it as two different animations that should be interlinked by an upgrade, which is really stupid. And that was not the case with the flash bolts. You put enemies into a stun state through the flash bolt, you can do a sneak attack without the need for an upgrade, and it's the same when you use a bottle against an enemy. And it's so ironic how you can use a bottle in the Evil Within 2 to put enemies into a stun state that looks identical to the stun state that is generated when you use a smoke bolt on an enemy without the upgrade. Yet you needed an upgrade to sneak kill enemies inside of the smoke, which was really fucking stupid. But just to talk about the talismans, the stun talisman just then, it works exactly like the Evil Within's flash bolts, which is wonderful design, and it's so useful for balance. Like, you saw how awkward it was dealing with that Kuchisake when I didn't have access to the stun talismans. Like, this game, it has the same mentality as the Evil Within series, or like the Resident Evil games after Resident Evil 4, and not the Resident Evil games before Resident Evil 4. Where you have got to be experimental with your arsenal if you're going to be dealing with the large assortment of enemies. Like, because of the fact that the game is stressing its arsenal so much, this gives the developers an excuse to put high-tiered enemies or multiple different enemies in single combat encounters that encourage you to strategize and save up on your consumables and also on your inventory. Like, inventory management is very important to Ghostwire Tokyo, and that's really good design. This isn't a game that is designed for really stupid runs like the strike attack runs or that people do, or like with knife-only runs that people like Tyner, that freaking idiot, does. But I'm not going to talk about those kind of people, even though they are pretty toxic as to leave stupid college essays on your channel just calling you shit, like Tyner did with me when I was doing my Knives Out video for Resident Evil Village. But we have another protection mission over here, and as you can see, when the enemies are draining these cubes, they are vulnerable to a quick purge. That right there is common sense, because spirits in media have a tendency to fixate and not really mind their surroundings, even though if you do sprint behind them, they will get alerted to you. But even when their social status icon goes red and they are alerted to you, you can still do the quick purge. That right there is basic common sense, and it removes so many awkward designs had that mechanic not been in place. Like, I imagine my friends would think differently about that. They call it easy, but it's just really well designed. Like, when the enemies are putting themselves into an animation that they don't necessarily have to do, I should be rewarded for punishing the enemies during a very specific animation that is so rare, or that they don't necessarily have to do. That's really good design. Oh, and also that right there, I know it seemed like I was trying to go into combat just then, but I wasn't. I was trying to demonstrate that even when an enemy goes into a flinch animation, as long as they haven't recognized you, you can still do the quick purge mechanic when they get out of the flinch animation. but that's all dependent upon the kind of flinch animation that they do, because there are certain flinch animations that you can generate when you're behind the enemy, but they will turn around as part of the normal protocol when they go into that specific flinch animation, like that guy did. And also, sometimes when you are sprinting into enemies when they're flinching, they have that tendency of canceling their flinch animations in order to fulfill the protocol of actually recognizing the noise. So don't be too reliant upon that. Instead, what you can do is you can shoot wind into an enemy to make them flinch, and as long as you're in a stealth profile and the social status icon hasn't filled up, the enemy's social status icon will be yellow, and they will investigate where the shot was fired from. So you can use that to isolate enemies, and when they turn around, you can quick purge them. But it varies, because this game has a mechanic from The Evil Within 2 that I don't like from that game. So with The Evil Within 2's massive world, not really massive though compared to a lot of open world games, and The Evil Within 2 wasn't even classed as an open world game, it's a linear game, but its pseudo open world design, or wide linear design, is meant to be on par with that of the open world design with its larger environments. Because of the fact that the Streets of Union were rather large, I'm guessing Tango Gameworks was trying to take pity on you, what they would do is, if enemies were chasing you, and they reached a certain threshold of their playable area, they would immediately stop trying to chase you, they would just flail about a bit, and then they would just walk away from you as if you've escaped combat, even though you're right in their line of sight, which doesn't make any sense. And it just took away a lot of opportunities for really hectic encounters where you're trying to run away from the enemies, and it was pretty dangerous, and also like high octane just trying to run away from the enemies, but because they would just stop. And it could also serve as a hindrance if you were trying to use certain mechanics to your advantage to lure enemies. And unfortunately, that same mechanic returns in Ghostwire Tokyo, only you don't notice it as much, and the enemies don't really do any kind of unique animation to indicate that they've exited their playable area. They'll instead just attack a bit, and then they won't be attacking you, they'll just be walking around a bit, and then they'll teleport away. And in certain cases, this can be good, and I totally understand when this design works. Like, for instance, in the final boss fight, like, any kind of boss fight where it's going to have other enemies supporting the boss, I don't want to be dealing with that. I want to be dealing with the boss itself. Like, that should not be a good excuse to just not really deliver with your boss very well. I mean, the final boss isn't so bad, but it is a very simple fight, but it's simple for a good reason, because the boss does have access to some pretty stupid abilities. At least I did find a way to work around that boss. Ooh, by the way, right here, do not go in the middle of that crossing, because occasionally there can be a side activity where you see a bunch of fog and a bunch of spirits coming out of it. That's one of the randomly generated events called the Hyaki Yako. It's basically like an accretion generated by the spirits there, that when you get near it, it will teleport you into a combat encounter. And you need to avoid that when trying to get in here, because it can sometimes manifest when you're getting inside the subway area in order to track Yasuo Toko, which is the first boss of this game. But here we have the Shibuya Underground. I do love Tokyo in this game. I mean, I get why people say that it is a very dead city and there's not a lot you can do, but I don't really agree with that. The side activities really flesh out the experience, and I'm pretty sure they're talking about the open world after you actually beat the main story. Which you don't actually beat the main story. What it does is, when you beat the story, it teleports you back to the title menu, and then when you hit continue, it puts you before you initiate the penultimate encounter. So it puts you in chapter 4. But, you know, most of the time with open world games, and this is really all the time actually, not really most of the time, whenever you do all the activities, or even when you do just the main story in the open world after the main story is always going to be boring. It's the case with every single open world game. I mean, aside from Assassin's Creed, I would say, because Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Revelations, there's something really fun about exploring the worlds of Rome and Constantinople, even after the main story, and just fooling around with the guards, and just hearing a lot of the ambient sounds. Like, those games do open world games really well. But every other open world game, whenever you beat the main story and you're going back into the open world, it's always very boring. And this game is no exception, unfortunately. Although, this game, it does allow you to play the various tracks that you hear within the game in the open world, there is a music track selection in the options menu that you can use in order to listen to music. Like, I always listen to Koamote's boss fight music in the open world. And Koamote is the second boss that you deal with. It's a stealth boss fight. And her music is my favorite piece of music in the entire game. And I always go into the music track selection in the pause menu and just listen to music and just hit the repeat button so that when it finishes, it just replays the song again. And that right there is pretty cool. But for everything else, guys, I guess this game could have done with a lot more neutral NPCs, like neutral spirits. Like those Nekomata, for instance, are neutral spirits. And maybe we could have had some yokai activities or like some way of actually like fleshing out the world. But I guess it would be kind of a little narrative dissonance, because in the main story, you are trying to rescue Mari, which is Akito's sister. And you're also meeting up with KK's gang, who is trying to help you deal with the main villain. I mean, really, it's only Rinko. Ed isn't really helping. He's just allowing you to transport spirits. And that's another thing as well. You see these spirits right over here? So you have access to consumables called katashiro that when filled, you then have to go to a phone booth in order to transport the spirits. For some reason, when you do beat the main story, you gain access to something called transmission beads, which allow you to just teleport spirits on the spot. But if you're going to be introducing such a pitiful reward like that feels complementary to just like quality of life, it should be something that you get in the main story, not something you get in New Game Plus. That right there is pretty dumb. And also, there's a trophy on this game where you have to collect all of those spirits, and then you have to beat the main story. And I think with the way they've implemented the spirits after the main story, and also with their implementation overall, I think it's just a little too tedious. Like when you're getting spirits alongside the main story, I mean, you're doing the main story, but then you're thinking, oh, I'll just get those spirits right there. Like you're not thinking about how tedious it can be, like, or how much of a task it can be, because it feels like it's blended perfectly with the main story. But when you're doing these kind of activities after the main story, and also like the game spawns in spirits in like buildings, and there's no possible way to transport spirits towards you so that you can then use your katashiro on them, I feel like it can be a really dumb incentive to force you to indulge in the world. And the game doesn't really make it clear where a lot of these spirits are, and if you miss out on spirits, backtracking to these areas can be really, really bad, and it can ruin your enjoyment and immersion into the world when you're wasting time just stumbling through areas trying to find spirits. But I'm gonna have to pause in this tangent right now because we have the first boss, and this is Yasuo Toko. So he can use the same elementals as you. So he only has 5 attacks, I believe, but with each element he has 1 attack. So the wind one is the most dangerous. This is the most dangerous attack he has right here. Even though I understand the timing on that, I still mess up that move. Like, wind with Yasuo Toko requires a lot of time and dedication to understand the timing, and to also understand that the rate at which these projectiles get to you is always the same. This is not like Resident Evil 7's case where, like for instance with the white molded, with those little tiny white molded, their jump attack, they always get to you in the same time, but their rate changes. So in the case of a linear equation, time is a constant, but here rate is a constant. And when rate is a constant, distance to Yasuo Toko is something that you need to bear in mind so that you get the rhythm down of when you're supposed to perfectly block him. But let me explain the other abilities. So he also has the ability to use fire and water. Here's his water one. So he will always close the distance to you, and when you see the projectile, you just gotta perfectly block it. It's very simple. Here's his block, by the way. You can run up to Yasuo Toko and melee his shield, and it will break instantly, but do not use the strike attack. I beg you, do not use the strike attack, because the detection on the strike attack on the shield is garbage. If you want to see moments of that happening, check out my blind playthrough. Instead, what you'll want to use is your bow. The bow is the most consistent way to remove that shield. I mean, there isn't really any incentive to remove the shield, aside from the fact that when you do break the shield, it does generate ether for you to use. But you're already getting a lot of ether from the crystallized ether that is around you, and that was his jump attack. And I didn't explain his fire one, but there's no real need, because fire is his least dangerous ability, because it's so easy to dodge. You just gotta strafe at the right moment and you'll be fine. And do not get close to him. I think he has melee attacks, but I haven't really seen. Or rather, I think he uses his range attacks at close range. And of course, timing when you are supposed to use your perfect block can be difficult with the wind. But with water, it isn't so bad. But we've done Yasuo Toko. That right there looked like a very simple fight, but it's not. It was very, very challenging on my blind playthrough, and on this recording, I restarted Yasuo Toko 3 times. But that's nothing compared to the second boss fight with him, because in the finale of the game, you have to fight Yasuo Toko a second time, and he has a second phase. He has a lot more life, and he can be very, very hard to anticipate. But that right there is the best boss of the game. Yasuo Toko is the game's combat at its best. It's the game's way of actually challenging you in a way that is complementary to the full potential of the game while not being reliant upon upgrades. Koamote is a stealth fight, but it's a really fun stealth fight, even if a lot of people might say it's simple. But as long as the fight has other elements that are really good, like for instance the music, or with the fact that you're hearing lore, or with the way Koamote looks, or with the satisfaction you get from actually stunning her and then using the quick purge by using the explosive barrels, or like just in general, if it's a very satisfying fight and you really feel like the power fantasy involved, it's a pretty good fight. Like, I don't care that it's not a stupidly awkward fight, which people will want to say is challenging. It's just a fight that has common sense. Obviously, Akito is separated from KK. It has to be a stealth fight. And, the stealth is simple because of the open world format, obviously. So, it's a good fight. And the music is so much fun. It's the best piece of music in the entire game. And then we get to bosses like Okina, and Okina is just very, very mindless. It's the most broken boss in all of Ghostwire Tokyo, and it's the first bad boss ever designed by Tango Gameworks. How the fuck could they settle on that kind of boss design when Evil Within 1 and Evil Within 2 did not have shitty boss designs that relied upon broken designs? The bosses in those games were not broken. And it also translates into the final boss as well, but only in a very rare moment where sometimes when you expose the core, which is supposed to generate a stun on the final boss, he ignores the stun. And I saved a blooper of this happening. And that right there is something you're going to have to see for yourself with its sheer stupidity. But Okinwa, or it's really Okina. I don't know why I keep saying Okinwa. I just like saying Okinwa rather than Okina. But Okina, she has a lot of really bullshit attacks, and the only way you're going to limit her moveset is to stand close to her and limit her moveset to about 3 moves in the first phase or 4 moves in the second phase. But you have to stay close to her and spam the charge attack on water, and when you have to limit a boss's moveset in order to remove badly designed attacks or limit the chances of input drops, because that's another problem with Okina's boss fight, there are certain moves that Okina does that involve you having to jump over pulses that she emits when she slams the ground. And the ground, it has some weird changes in elevation that impact your ability to jump, because obviously when you're falling down, you're not going to be able to jump, but there are just minor changes in the elevation that aren't noticeable on the ground that lead to this problem, making it impossible to dodge any of Okina's attacks at times. Even if this is the case, there is also one bullshit attack that Okina has, where she does this one slam where 2 pulses emanate from the slam. And the pulses, the rate at which they come out of her hands, you cannot jump over them twice. It's impossible. You cannot initiate 2 jumps in rapid succession because the speed at which the game allows you to initiate 2 jumps in rapid succession is slower than the rate at which those pulses emanate from her hands in that one attack. But I need to showcase Okina's boss when I get the chance. But just continuing on, like, when the boss is going to have these kind of problems, you know the developers designed a broken fight that clearly shows they were high on drugs when designing the fight. And because of these problems, I do not do Okina no damage. She just isn't worth it. Like, she doesn't deserve any respect if she's going to be that broken. Other people may try to indulge in doing a restriction against her that's complementary to showing respect to the boss if it's actually taking place within the realm of functional good designs rather than the realm of stupid designs. But other people doing that, That's really feeble. Like there's no reason to respect those kinds of bosses. There's no reason to indulge in restrictions or any kind of run that is not complementary to the overall game design, and it's just a really desperate attempt to somehow try to salvage the good designs of the game or from a boss fight. And in this case, don't waste your time. Just don't give her any respect. Just do whatever you can to finish her off very quickly. And right now, we're trying to reunite with KK, given that Yasuo Toko had separated us from KK. It's still kind of confusing to this day how exactly Akito is able to separate from KK and not die. Based on the introduction, it made it seem like KK's possession of Akito was what was allowing Akito to be 1 foot in the grave, but still be alive. And somehow he's still alive even after KK separates. I mean, Rinko did hint towards some kind of residual connection, but I don't know. I feel like they should have refined that detail a little bit better. Like I said, the story on this game, I do love that the spiritual element of the game is a lot more reserved and isn't so over the top, and they're not pulling ideas out of thin air like some typical spiritual anime where they have to come up with all these really stupid ideas for like seals or for some kind of spells or all these other annoying things that just take place with magic because magic has no limits, and therefore this is what allows the plot to be so convoluted. But this game doesn't do that, which is one of the things that I really appreciate about this game. Its spirituality is a lot more simple, and it isn't trying to pull concepts out of thin air, and it at least tries to refine a lot of the concepts it brings through the database entries. And that right there is definitely a positive I can give to the game, but it still doesn't change the fact that the main story could have done with a lot more refinement. But once we reunite with KK and we get introduced to the Wire In ability, which is this game's super ability where you initiate a pulse and you're able to expose the cores easily, that will be the end of Chapter 2, and this will be the end of this first part of the walkthrough. Stay tuned for the future chapters. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.